The title of tonight's lecture is Roots of Conflict, Prospects for Peace. Unfortunately, the media and pro-Israeli groups tend to start history at their own discretion. They conveniently forget the root cause of the conflict. Moreover, in Palestine, the root cause of the conflict is just as relevant today as it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, even as far back as 1897. To be able to achieve peace, you must understand the roots of conflict. What better speaker to address this topic than our guest speaker, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. Dr. Norman Finkelstein received his doctorate in 1988 from the Department of Politics at Princeton University for a thesis on the theory of Zionism. He currently teaches political theory at DePaul University in Chicago. Finkelstein is the author of 5 books. His most recent book is Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history, which we are selling at the tables. Proceeds will be going to Islamic Relief Palestine Fund. So if everybody could join me in welcoming Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for having me. And beautiful out here. I come from Chicago. Bertrand Russell in his autobiography described Chicago as that bleak, hideous city. And he's quite right on that question and many others. But here it's really beautiful. It's a pleasure to come here. The topic I'm going to speak on tonight is one which has interested me more and more in recent years, and it's a kind of paradox. Namely, how do you account for all the controversy that swirls around the conflict, which, if you look at the actual historical record, human rights record, diplomatic record, that is to say, the record in the past, the present, and the future, it's remarkably uncontroversial. It's a remarkable level of consensus on the conflict. And the same kind of question comes up when you look at the reception of former President Jimmy Carter's recent book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. When you actually look at the content of the book is remarkably uncontroversial. It's a rather tepid rendering of what the documentary record shows. And yet, this hysteria swirled around the book upon its publication. And the question is, why? Why all of this hysteria and controversy surrounding the conflict, which, if you look at the actual record, is remarkably uncontroversial? I can't quote the words exactly, I don't have it in front of me, but I know teaching at your university is Ze'ev Ma'oz, a very smart guy. And he recently came out with a hefty volume, at least in English. It's called Defending the Holy Land. Anyone here read it? It's a very good book. And at some point, I hope he's not here to challenge my rendering of the quote, but at some point he writes that in 100 years, people are going to look back and wonder why this conflict has not been resolved. He said, as compared to other conflicts, this one is relatively simple. It's just not that complicated. And so the question I want to ask is, from whence the controversy. And the argument I'm going to make this evening is that the vast preponderance of the controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict is fabricated, it's conjured up, it's contrived, the purpose being to deflect attention from and sow confusion about an actual documentary record which is so damning of Israel. Let me begin with one illustration which I think vividly captures the essence of what I want to speak about this evening, namely the International Court of Justice, the World Court, in July 2004, rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel has been building in the occupied territories. Former President Carter actually has a lot of interesting things to say on the topic of the wall. He says at one point, and I'm quoting him, "Imprisonment wall is more descriptive than security fence." And probably the most important chapter in his book is chapter 16, entitled "The Wall as a Prison." Incidentally, I won't get back to Ma'oz, but everybody here should make a point of reading chapter 10 of his book on the whole issue of weapons of mass destruction. It's a brilliant exposition of the issues, and he comes to, I think, a very sane conclusion, in fact, a very hopeful conclusion. He says, if we're worried about the spread and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, he says there's an obvious solution, a fairly simple one. Israel should join in creating a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. That's just a conclusion. Obviously, what's more interesting is how he argues it. And I found it both, as I said, both illuminating, and also it was hopeful to see that there are rational people out there on all sides of the conflict. In any case, returning to the question of this wall, the World Court, as I said, rendered a landmark decision in July 2004. And in order to render its decision on the legality of the wall, they first had to address a series of preliminary questions. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo or the jargon of the Israel-Palestine conflict, you'll know there's this thing called the peace process, and within the peace process, there's this other thing called the final status questions. That is to say, the questions bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which are considered so controversial, so subject to dispute, that they have to be deferred to the last stage of negotiations, because we're told they're so complicated. Well, as it happens, the World Court, the highest judicial body in the world, they have to render an opinion on almost all of these final status questions before it could render an opinion on the legality of the wall. So what are these final status questions? Number one, the question of borders. What are the legal borders of the state of Israel, and what ought to be the legal borders of a future state of Palestine? The World Court is very clear on that question. It states that under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. That's a principle anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, It's also prominently featured in the best-known resolution on the Israel-Arab conflict, namely UN Resolution 242, which begins by saying it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Accordingly, the World Court rules that the West Bank and Gaza, the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel has no right to any of it. And they repeatedly state over and over again in their advisory opinion that the whole of the West Bank and Gaza are occupied Palestinian territory. Contrary to what we're told here in the U.S., that these are disputed territories, not so, says the World Court. There is no dispute whatsoever. These are occupied Palestinian territories. When former President Carter writes in his book that according to UN Resolution 242, and now I'm quoting him, Israel's acquisition of territory by force is illegal, that Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories, that the borders of Israel must coincide with those of June 1967, apart from mutually agreeable land swaps. Former President Carter is not making a controversial statement. He is simply rendering the opinion of the highest judicial body in the world. Number two, the question of the settlements, the 460,000 Jewish settlers and their settlements in the occupied territories. What is their legal status? Is it a complicated question? Current President Bush, he recently said that Israel has to have the right to retain some of those settlements. But not so, says the World Court. They say under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as Security Council resolutions, these settlements constitute, and now I'm calling it, a flagrant violation of international law. They are all illegal. Israel has no right to any settlements in the occupied territories. The question of East Jerusalem, we're often told that's a very complicated question. Israel claims East Jerusalem as part of its eternal and undivided capital. But not so, says the World Court. They keep referring to East Jerusalem as part of occupied Palestinian territory. It was conquered in June 1967. Its status is identical to all the other territories that were acquired by war. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is not just what the World Court ruled, but how uncontroversial it was. For those of you who are students of international law, you'll know that World Court decisions and opinions are often quite close. It's like our own Supreme Court, where decisions, because the Supreme Court and the World Court are the last stage of deliberation or adjudication, it often means these are controversial questions, and so unsurprisingly, there would be close votes. But what I just rendered to you now, that record, it wasn't close at all. The vote was 14-1. The only dissenting voice or vote came from the American judge, Thomas Bergenthal. And even in the case of the single dissenting vote, it was a very qualified dissent. Bergenthal does not call his opinion a dissent. He uses the more neutral language, calling it a declaration. And he begins his declaration by saying that there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then he goes on to say that on the crucial question, the question of those settlements, which are really the heart and the core of the problem, even Bergenthal is moved to write that he agrees there can be no question under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, those settlements are illegal. And he goes on to say that if Israel is building a wall to protect or incorporate those settlements, then he says, ipso facto, that wall is illegal under international law. Which means, on all of those controversial final status questions, which we're told are so difficult to resolve, on all of those questions, 14 out of 15 of the judges regard them as not controversial at all, and the 15th judge on the most crucial question, the status of the settlements, agrees with all the other judges. And that then returns us to the same question. If that's true, then how do you account for all of the controversy surrounding the conflict? I'll return to that presently. Let me begin, however, by looking at that record I referred to at the beginning, the historical record, the human rights record, and the diplomatic record. Let's begin with the historical record. There are some older people in the room, not many, those who go back to the day, as students call it, those who, when they studied high school chemistry, the chemicals, the elements only went up to number 78. I think that's as far as it went when I was in high school. It's grown a lot. For those who remember the conflict from, say, the 1960s and the 1970s, they will surely remember that the most controversial historical question on the Israel-Palestine conflict was, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are younger and not fully up to speed on the conflict, in 1948 there's a war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the newly born state of Israel and its Arab neighbors, and by the end of the war, about 750,000 Palestinians were no longer in their homes. And the question has always come up, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? The standard line of Israel and its supporters, which was generally accepted even in scholarship, was that the Arab armies stood poised on the borders of a newly born state of Israel, and the Arab leaders transmitted radio messages to the Palestinian Arabs to clear the fields for the invading Arab armies, and that once the Arab states had succeeded in sweeping the Jews into the sea, the Palestinian Arabs would be able to return to their homes. As I said, that was pretty much a commonplace, the famous Arab radio broadcasts. Beginning in the 1980s, the mid to late 1980s, Israeli historians first and foremost, but others as well, began looking through the Israeli documentary record, the archival record, and they reached the conclusion that there was no evidence whatsoever for this claim of Arab radio broadcasts urging the Palestinians to leave. The best known of those historians is a fellow named Benny Morris, who currently teaches at Ben Gurion University. And Benny Morris now frankly acknowledges, he says what happened in 1948 was, in his words, an ethnic cleansing. Not a total ethnic cleansing, because about 160,000 Arabs remain within Israel, of whom one spoke before me, but it was an ethnic cleansing. Now, it is true that there is still some debate about what happened to those refugees. People like Benny Morris claim that they became refugees as an accident of war. We all know that wars breed refugees, and he says that these Palestinian refugees, or the refugee question, was born of war, not by design. And then there are others who say, not true, that the Palestinians were systematically, methodically, and premeditatedly ethnically cleansed in 1948. To give you some sense of how narrow the spectrum is, you take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami. He was Israel's negotiator at Camp David in 2000. He recently came out with a good book. It's entitled Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. And Shlomo Ben-Ami addresses the question, how did the Palestinians become refugees in 1948? And he says, well, I agree with Benny Morris, they were ethnically cleansed. But, says the former foreign minister, I don't believe it was an accident. I don't think it was a happenstance of war. He says the cleansing of the Palestinians in 48 was based on, and now I'm quoting him, the Zionist philosophy of transfer. That is to say, the intention of the Zionist movement from early on to rid Palestine of its indigenous population. As I said, that's quite striking. The former foreign minister now takes the most extreme position on what happened in 48. Not only was it an ethnic cleansing, but it was a premeditated, methodical cleansing of the indigenous population. Let's now turn to the current situation, the present. And that basically means the human rights record in the occupied territories. We're often told it's so complicated. The Arabs say one thing, the Israelis say another thing, and then we are supposed to throw our hands up in despair. Who knows who's telling the truth? But there is a third party, or cluster of parties, to whom every rational person would turn. And that is all of those human rights organizations which monitor the Israel-Palestine conflict. Everyone in the room knows the names of some of them: Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and then there are a whole slew of reputable and honorable local human rights organizations, the best known of which is B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. Now, it's very striking when you read this record. For example, number one, human rights law is a relatively new branch of international law, which means there are a lot of gray areas. What do terms mean? How do you apply them? And so forth. Number two, there are so many human rights organizations, each of which has its own research staff, legal staff, and field staff. Number three, a lot of human rights work is very vulnerable to human error and human flaw. So, for example, what does human rights work consist of? In no small part, it consists of this. There's a demonstration in the city of Hebron. On one side is the Israeli army. On the other side are the Palestinian demonstrators. Human rights field workers learn about this demonstration. They come out to observe it. They, for example, turn first to the Palestinian demonstrators and they check to see, did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And if they used live ammunition, were they on the periphery of the crowd or were they in the midst of the crowd? All of those questions make a difference for human rights work. And then on the Israeli side, the army side, did the army initiate the clash? And if it did, was it in a life-threatening situation? And if it was, did they first fire warning shots? And if they did they aim at the legs, the torso, or the head? That also makes a difference for human rights work. Now, as some of you know, anyone here see the great Kurosawa film, Rashomon? Raise your hand. Not a disaster. The Kurosawa film, Rashomon, is the famous film about several people observing the same incident and remembering it all together differently. And you would expect that so many different human rights organizations, so many different field workers, that they would see the same incident differently. And there's all of this gray area in human rights law. There are all of these organizations. The reasonable expectation would be that the human rights organizations would disagree on many questions. It was very striking to me for the book I recently wrote. I went through thousands of pages of human rights reports from about a 15-year period. And I can tell you without fear of contradiction or without fear of a polygraph were now put on my wrist that it would miss a single beat, that from all of those thousands and thousands of pages of human rights reports, stretching over a period of 15 years, I was only able to detect a single case of a single incident on a single afternoon in a single city of the occupied territories where two human rights organizations disagreed on anything. And the disagreement was actually quite trivial. There is no dispute about what Israel is doing in the occupied territories when you ask not the officials of the Israeli government and army, but when you ask the human rights organizations. So let's take a simple example. The one which is most frequently commented upon in the press, in the media, namely the question of fatalities, deaths in the occupied territories and Israel. As most of you know, in January 2006, the Palestinians elected a new government headed by Hamas, the Islamic movement, and immediately as this new government was elected, led by the United States, the international community imposed brutal economic sanctions on the Palestinians. And the rationale was, firstly, that Hamas sanctioned terrorism, and until it renounced terrorism, Hamas was not, or the Palestinians were going to suffer these brutal sanctions? Well, from my point of view at any rate, of course Hamas has to renounce terrorism. Under international law, the targeting of civilians for political purposes is illegal. That's the conventional definition of terrorism. And Hamas is bound to respect those basic principles of international law. That, I think, is a no-brainer. The problem, however, arises about the application of this principle. A leading Israeli scholar, Shabtai Rosen, he wrote, one of the fundamental principles of international law is the principle of reciprocity. That's just a fancy way of saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So we agree, no brainer, Hamas has to renounce terrorism. But then we have that principle of reciprocity. What about Israel? What is its record on terrorism? Let's look at the undisputed record, undisputed when you look at the human rights organizations. Approximately 4,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis have been killed since the beginning of what's called the New Intifada, that is, since September 28, 2000. That's a ratio of about 4 to 1. On both sides, the overwhelming number of casualties have been civilians. According to human rights organizations, the vast majority have been civilians. Again, the ratio remains 4 to 1. However, those of you who are savvy in these matters are no doubt thinking, as we're often told in the media, but isn't there a difference between Palestinians targeting Israeli civilians and Israel unintentionally killing Palestinian civilians? Isn't there a difference? Or, as the New Yorker's Middle East correspondent, a fellow named Jeffrey Goldberg, he recently wrote a much acclaimed book called Prisoners, and at one point he writes, Goldberg has dual Israeli-American citizenship. He says, for God's sake, we don't try to kill children, meaning the Israelis. Okay, what does the record show? That's what the New Yorker says. What does the real world say? 811 Palestinian children have been killed during the Second Intifada. That is more than the total number of Israeli civilians killed. 711, of whom 109 were children. So the ratio on children killed, it's about 8 to 1 against the Palestinians. Or take the year 2006, this past year. 141 Palestinian children were killed, as compared to 17 Israeli civilians, of whom 1 was a child. The ratio, 141 to 1. So, the first preliminary conclusion is, for the want of trying to kill Palestinian children, it would seem that Israelis were awfully good at it. What do the human rights records say, however, human rights reports say, on the question of intentionality? According to human rights organizations, unarmed Palestinian children were, on many occasions, deliberately targeted by Israeli soldiers. In other cases, Israel used indiscriminate, excessive, and disproportionate force. It's a very striking fact I came across a couple of weeks ago reading a new book. Of the 37 Palestinian children killed in the first month of the Second Intifada, just in the first month, of the 37 Palestinian children killed, fully 20 died from a direct bullet shot to the head. This question of indiscriminate killing, is indiscriminate killing of people any different than intentional killing? Under international law, there's no difference. Just look at the question practically. If somebody has a dagger and takes the dagger and plunges it into your heart, and then goes before the judge and says, I didn't intend to kill him, I was just testing the sharpness of the blade. Well, it's obviously preposterous. Namely, under international law, you are held accountable for the inevitable, foreseeable, and natural consequences of your act. It counts as intention. If you take a dagger and plunge it into someone's heart, whatever you claim, it counts as your intention that you wanted to kill the person. In the same way, if Israel fires indiscriminately into a crowd of Palestinian demonstrators, the inevitable, foreseeable, and natural consequence is you will kill many innocent children. And that counts as intention.
But among the demonstrators...
Okay.
Shut up! Stop it, boy!
Okay.
There are children, there are armed people among the demonstrators. Joseph, man. Joseph, man. Why do you think that children would buy something? Why children buy something? You're not the speaker.
So, Haaretz newspaper, Israel's most influential newspaper, after an Israeli atrocity in Beit Hanun, Gaza, when they were firing artillery in civilian neighborhoods, wrote as follows: no excuse can justify this atrocity. When artillery batteries aim their shells near a residential neighborhood, such a disaster is inevitable, even if it is unintentional. Anyone who fired shells in the direction of civilian houses knows very well that he is liable to kill indiscriminately with them. Or Gideon Levy, Israel's one of Haaretz's main correspondents in the occupied territories. He has a very good metaphor, I think. He says, someone who throws burning matches into a forest can claim he didn't mean to set it on fire. And anyone who bombs residential neighborhoods with artillery can claim he didn't mean to kill innocent inhabitants. Therefore, it takes considerable gall and cynicism to dare to claim that the Israeli Defense Forces did not, listen to his words, did not intend to kill inhabitants in Beit Hanun. If that's the inevitable consequence of firing indiscriminately, it is intentional, no different than what's claimed rightly against Hamas. And in fact, Israel's leading authority in international law, a very smart fellow, I wish he wouldn't spend so much time using his smarts to defend the indefensible, but there's no question he's a smart guy. A fellow named Yoram Dinstein, the president of Tel Aviv University, if you read his standard work on international human rights law, he says, and now I'm quoting him, there is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of, and reckless use of force, which is what Israel is accused of. And now his final words, they are equally forbidden. Where does that leave us? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are: one, Israeli terrorism is 4 times as lethal, 4 times as deadly as Hamas terrorism, and 2, contrary to what Shabtai Rosen said, the international community doesn't apply the principle of reciprocity. No demand has been put on Israel to renounce terrorism. Let me now turn to the third dimension of the conflict. How do you resolve this conflict? We're told it's so complicated, so difficult to resolve. And yet, for the past 30 years and more, there has been a settlement on the table to resolve the conflict. I dare say everybody in this room has heard of it. It's called the two-state settlement. A full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, in accordance with the principle of international law that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war, and on the other side, full recognition by the Arab states as well as a Palestinian state of Israel's right to live in peace with its neighbors. That's also international law under AURU, PALU, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. And that's it. Every single year. I know that some people have perplexed looks on their face, as, for example, what are Nauru, Palu, and Tuvalu? And I have to admit that although I am supposed to teach the topic, until recently I had never heard of them. I'm now aware that Nauru's main export is guano, that's bird droppings, and Tuvalu, as we speak, is on the verge of extinction due to global warming, which is an interesting story in itself, because as everyone here surely knows, the main obstacle to this global warming problem is the United States' refusal to sign the Kyoto Protocol. And so because the U.S. refuses to sign the Kyoto Protocol, the tide is rising. And as the tide is rising, Tuvalu is disappearing. And as Tuvalu disappears, one of Israel's main allies in the world disappears. So, it's only a matter of time before Israel accuses the United States of anti-Semitism. When former President Carter writes in his book, Israel's continued control and colonization of Palestinian land have been the primary obstacles to a comprehensive peace agreement. And when he concludes his book by stating, peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders. When President Carter makes those statements, he's not making controversial statements. He's simply accurately rendering what the international community has been saying for decades, and which Israel has, with crucial U.S. backing, steadfastly resisting. That is, accepting its legal borders under international law. In fact, it's very striking. One of the leading authorities of international law is a fellow, he's now, I think he's since passed, Quincy Wright. I was reading some things on the '67 war. We're talking now 40 years ago. That is to say, 2 generations past most of the people in this room. Already in 1968, Quincy Wright said, in view of the acceptance of Resolution 242 by the adjacent Arab states except Syria, the major obstacle to progress seems to be the refusal of Israel to do so and to agree to withdraw from occupied territories. That's been the problem for 40 years. Israel's refusal to accept its borders under international law. Now let's look at the real world, or I should say, let's look at the fantasy world. The second condition imposed on Hamas to get those sanctions lifted, the first was to renounce terrorism. The second was they must recognize the state of Israel. Well, as a matter of fact, as of now, Hamas has recognized Israel in its June 1967 borders as a practical reality. They have met that condition of the international community. But what about Israel? The principle of reciprocity. No Israeli government has ever recognized the Palestinian state in the whole of the occupied territories with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's the state under international law. In fact, as the world demands that Hamas recognize Israel, the current Israeli government, as we speak, is building a wall that annexes about 10% of the West Bank illegally, that annexes East Jerusalem illegally, that severs the West Bank into fragments, that has now been attempting to ethnically cleanse and annex the Jordan Valley, which is about a third of the West Bank. Well, what's left then? Carter, in his book, I thought quite eloquently, he writes, the wall will complete the enclosure of a severely truncated Palestine, a small portion of its original size, compartmentalized, divided into cantons, occupied by Israeli security forces, and isolated from the outside world. Well, some of you are thinking, well, that's Carter, and we know Carter. Okay, so let's see what Israel's main newspaper, Haaretz, says, describing current Israeli plans, operational plans. Between the eastward expansion of Ma'ale Adunim, one of the main Israeli settlements, the westward expansion of the Jordan Valley, and the expansion of the settlement blocks towards the Green Line, that is Israel's June 67 border, the Palestinians are left with no territory on which to establish a state. But we're told the only problem is that Hamas won't recognize Israel. It's very striking when you look at the real record, the monumental hypocrisy of it all. There's a very smart human rights lawyer and writer, a fellow named John Dugard. He's considered the founder of human rights law in South Africa. And he's a very first-rate international lawyer. He's also the UN's Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Palestine. A lot of these special rapporteurs in the UN ought to crack a book or two, but he's not one of them. He's a smart guy. He's a serious guy. And he writes recently, referring to these sanctions, these brutal sanctions designed to ground the Palestinians into defeat, submission. He says, in effect, the Palestinian people have been subjected to economic sanctions. The first time in history an occupied people has been so treated. This is difficult to understand. Israel is in violation of major Security Council and General Assembly resolutions dealing with unlawful territorial change and a violation of human rights. Israel has failed to implement the World Court opinion to dismantle the wall. Yet, Israel escapes the imposition of any sanctions. Instead, the Palestinian people, rather than the Palestinian Authority, have been subjected to possibly the most rigorous form of international sanctions imposed in modern times. That, as I see it, it's a thumbnail sketch, but that's what all that time allows. That, as I see it, is the actual record in the conflict. The historical record, the human rights record, the diplomatic record, the past, the present, and the future. And what I want to do now is explore all of this contrived and fabricated controversy, the purpose of which is to confuse people about what that record actually shows and to deflect attention from that record. Before doing so, however, I want to acknowledge, because it's correct to acknowledge, that there are aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict which, in my opinion, are legitimate points of disagreement. And the best known, I think the hardest one to resolve, is the question of those Palestinian refugees. As we mentioned earlier, there were about 750,000 Palestinians made refugees in 1948. Another 300,000 approximately became refugees in 1967, and with natural growth, the number now hovers between 4 and 5 million. It's a large number. And I want to look briefly at this question of the refugees, trying to suggest where I think there is no legitimate agreement and where I think there is legitimate disagreement. Let's begin with some basics. People can agree on facts, but render altogether different moral judgments on the facts. What does that mean? Well, take this fellow Benny Morris, who I mentioned earlier, the Israeli professor who has written The Palestinian Refugees. He says, I don't dispute it was an ethnic cleansing in 1948, but he says, I think it was a good thing. Sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things, says Professor Morris. He says, take the example of North America. Had it not been, and now I'm using his word, had it not been for the annihilation of the native population, you couldn't have had the great American Republic. So it was a good thing to annihilate them. And in fact, he says that Israel's main mistake in 1948 was that it didn't expel all the Palestinians from what became Israel, as well as the West Bank and Gaza. Had they all been expelled, he said, we wouldn't have these problems today. Just like Germany rid itself of the Jewish question, and so it doesn't have these problems today. Or Alan Dershowitz of Harvard, he says that ethnic cleansings are, to use his words, a fifth-rate human rights issue analogous to massive urban renewal. Well, you can't really say those judgments are wrong in the same way as facts are wrong. They agree on the facts, they have a different moral judgment. I don't think you can call the moral judgment wrong. You can call it, in my opinion, a Nazi moral judgment, but not a wrong moral judgment. If you leave Professor Dershowitz and Morris aside for a moment and return to the universe of the moral universe of normal human beings, problems still arise. And here it becomes a little more complicated and will make some people uneasy. Because you can agree on the facts, you can agree on your moral judgments, you can agree on your legal judgments, and still disagree in your political judgments. Well, how can that be? Most people think their political judgments spring from their moral and legal judgments. Not necessarily so. So take the case of Professor Chomsky. He'll say the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. That's what the factual record shows. Not controversial. He'll say ethnic cleansings are moral abominations. That's a no-brainer. He'll say legally Palestinians have a right to return to their homes. That too is simply not controversial. Human Rights Watch 2000, it states that it urges Israel to recognize the right of return. Amnesty International 2001, it calls for Palestinians to be able to exercise their right of return. Among mainstream human rights organizations, the right of return as a legal right is uncontroversial. However, Professor Chomsky, acknowledging all these facts, nonetheless says, politically, not factually, not morally, not legally, politically, he says, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic. And he says, in his view, it's immoral to tell Palestinians living in refugee camps in Lebanon that they're going to be returning to their homes when you know that isn't true. And in my view, that's a legitimate political judgment. And judgment is just that. Judgment means weighing 1,000 different factors and trying to figure out what is and what is not realistic and possible. Different people weighing those same factors, come to different conclusions. Some, weighing all the factors, say, I disagree with Professor Chomsky. I think it is realistic to implement the right of return. And I think honest people have to agree, or should agree, to disagree on that question. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to it, and people can have different political judgments on the viability and practicality of the implementing the right of return. Having said that, I would want to enter two qualifications. Number one, acknowledging the complicatedness of that right of return, we should bear in mind and not forget the overarching obstacle to resolving the conflict is exactly the one that President Carter wrote. Israel's refusal to obey international law and return to its legal borders. And number two, on whatever side you come down regarding the political feasibility of the right of return, we ought not for a moment to forget that as a legal right, there is no controversy within international law on the Palestinians' legal right to return to their homes. That now leaves me with the burden of the rest of the evening. If everything I'm saying is true, for argument's sake, at least for now, let's agree to that. No, just for argument's sake. I'm willing certainly to entertain objections when we come to questions and answers. Then the question is, where does the controversy come from? Or, to put it in personal terms, and I've not put it in these terms before, but I'll put it in these terms now, why am I so controversial? As far as I can tell, all I'm doing is repeating what mainstream scholarship, mainstream human rights organizations, and mainstream international lawyers have said on the topic. In my opinion, most of this controversy, including the controversy that occasionally surrounds myself, most of it is fabricated. Most of it is contrived. Most of it is fake. And this kind of fake controversy takes basically three forms. First of all, there's this effort to mystify the Israel-Palestine conflict, to pretend that it's so complicated. It's about a clash of religions and a clash of civilizations. It's about ancient hatreds. It's so complicated that it requires a knowledge, the equivalent of rocket science, to penetrate its mysteries. Or it's so unique that it can't be compared to any other conflict. What's the purpose of this claim about the complexity and the uniqueness of the conflict? Well, the most obvious purpose is, if you claim the Israel-Palestine conflict is unique and uniquely complicated, it preempts, it prevents making the obvious analogies. And the reason they don't want you to make those analogies is because Israel always comes out on the wrong side. So, if you look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, up until 1948, the most obvious analogy is the fate of the native population in North America. It's not a perfect analogy, but if it were perfect, it wouldn't be an analogy. Analogy means there are significant commonalities such that they are illuminating. I once wrote a text comparing the fate of the Native Americans, in particular the Cherokee Indians, with the fate of the Palestinians, the analogy worked pretty well. Not perfect, but certainly illuminating. Or, if you make the most obvious analogy with the current situation, the most obvious analogy, as everybody knows, is the comparison with apartheid in South Africa. No aspect of Carter's book evoked more outrage than his comparing of Israeli policy with apartheid. The Washington Post called this comparison foolish and unfair. The Boston Globe said it was irresponsibly provocative. The Times reported that Jewish groups condemned it as dangerous and anti-Semitic. Okay, now let's once again return to the real world. What does the real world show? Israel's main human rights organization for the occupied territories is called B'Tselem. 2002, B'Tselem produces this huge report on Israel's settlements policy. What does the report conclude? Quote, Israel has created in the occupied territories a regime of separation based on discrimination, applying two separate systems of law in the same area, and basing the rights of individuals on their nationality. This regime is the only one of its kind in the world, and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. 2005, B'Tselem produces a new report on the Jews-only roads that Israel is building in the occupied territories. It's called Forbidden Roads. What does B'Tselem conclude? It says that this road system bears striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime. And it goes on to say that Israel's road system entails a greater degree of arbitrariness than was the case with the regime that existed in South Africa. Now, some of you are thinking, well, those are human rights organizations. You know, they have these weird ideas about the equality of humankind. So, let's look at what Haaretz has to say, Israel's most influential newspaper. September 2006. The apartheid regime in the territories remains intact. Millions of Palestinians are living without rights, freedom of movement, or a livelihood under the yoke of ongoing Israeli occupation. Or Israel's former Attorney General, not an old Attorney General, from 1993 to 1996, Michael Ben Yair. He writes, "We enthusiastically chose to become a colonial society, ignoring international treaties, expropriating lands, transferring settlers from Israel to the occupied territories, engaging in theft, and finding justification for all these activities. Passionately desiring to keep the occupied territories, we developed two judicial systems. In effect, we established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories, immediately following their capture, which exists to this day." Or, when the whole hysteria started up surrounding Carter's book, Israel's former Minister of Education, Shulamit Aloni, she entered the fray and she said, "The U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Jimmy Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth. The truth which is known to all, but known to none in the United States." That's my editorializing. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies. In fact, this is so uncontroversial in the real world that when former Prime Minister Sharon was asked by the Italian Foreign Minister, how does he propose to resolve this conflict with the occupied territories, he reportedly replied, the Bantustan model, the apartheid model, was the most appropriate solution to the conflict. Well, is this conflict so complicated to understand? You open up Jeffrey Goldberg's book, Prisoners. He's writing for a New Yorker audience. They understand profound things, unlike the unwashed masses, the stupid masses. And he has a very profound explanation. He says the root of the conflict is that Muslim mind. Those Muslims who are seething with that Nietzschean ressentiment, envious of the Jews. So he writes, it was terribly hard for Muslims to accept that their inferiors, the Jews, now ruled Palestine. This made no sense in the worldview of many Arab Muslims who, if secretly insecure about their primacy in the world, were at least sure that they were better than the Jews. That's the root of the conflict, according to the New Yorker correspondent. But then you turn to conventional historians, not radical ones. You take the case of Benny Morris himself. He has this hefty volume called Righteous Victims. It's a standard text in college classrooms. How many people have used it here? I'm just curious. Yeah. Morris, he's now so far on the right end of the spectrum, he's fallen off. But when it comes to the history, he's not dead. He has to ask himself the question, why don't these Arabs like Zionists? Is it because of their Muslim mind? He writes, the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. The fear of losing your home and losing your country. That was the chief reason why Arabs did not like Zionism. Or, as he goes on to say, transfer, the euphemism for expulsion, and this is quite interesting what he acknowledges. Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. And this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs. What's most striking when you read Morris, he doesn't say the Arabs resisted. Okay. He does, I think that's incorrect. I'm looking at the clock up there. Allow me 1 second. Always negotiations. And what's most striking when you read Morris, he doesn't even mention anti-Semitism. He doesn't mention hatred of Jews. He doesn't mention fear of Enlightenment values. he doesn't mention fear of the emancipation of women. That's not the reason. The reason is very straightforward. Why Arabs resist Zionism? Fear of losing their home and losing their country. Fear of territorial dispossession and displacement. What's especially peculiar about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that in any other case, the kinds of explanations which are used in this conflict would be transparently ludicrous. So you take the case of North America. We shouldn't be so politically correct as to forget that the Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. The Native Americans killed men, they killed women, they killed children. They were yesterday's terrorists. They were called, back then, until quite recently, they were called savages. Yet, what would anyone here think if a historian were to come along and say that the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, the chief motor was anti-Europeanism or anti-Christianism or anti-whiteism or, in Goldberg's terms, envy of those European iPods, well, you would laugh. Because it happens that the obvious explanation, Native Americans like Palestinians, the obvious explanation, they feared losing their homes. The simple explanation also happens to be a sufficient explanation. You don't have to conjure up these exotic explanations about a Muslim mind. The second kind of fake controversy is this playing of the Holocaust card, the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust into the Israel-Palestine conflict. Time doesn't allow me to go into that, certainly not with this timekeeper. Time doesn't allow me to go into that. Let me just make the obvious point that the main innovation of this Holocaust industry was what came to be called the Holocaust uniqueness doctrine. The claim that no people in the history of humanity had ever suffered the way Jews suffered during World War II. Intellectually, the doctrine is completely empty and barren, and morally, it's an abomination, this ranking of human suffering. But politically, it was quite useful. Because if you can claim that a people suffered uniquely, then you could argue that they shouldn't be held to conventional, ordinary, moral, and legal standards. So what happened? If it were true, and it was, that Israel was the only country in the world to legalize torture, if it were true, and it was, that Israel was the only country in the world to legalize house demolitions as a legal form of punishment, if it were true that Israel was the only country in the world, and it was, to legalize hostage-taking, or what they called bargaining chips, in response we were told, well, but remember the Holocaust, that you can't hold Israel to the same standard as every other country. Eventually, and in fact from fairly long ago, the Nazi Holocaust became a weapon against Arabs generally. 1948, Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, says that the Arabs were the disciples and even the teachers of Hitler. 1961, during the Eichmann trial, the Israelis claimed that it was the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian leader, who was the real mastermind of the final solution. Between the 1950s and 60s, for those whose memories stretch back that far, we were told that the president of Egypt, Mr. Nasser, he was the new Hitler. 1991, Saddam Hussein was Hitler. 2002, Saddam Hussein again is Hitler. Anybody who opposed the U.S.'s illegal war against Iraq was accused of appeasing the new Hitler. Now we're told Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler, Iran is Hitler, everyone is Hitler. And so you have this paradox. It's hard to say what's more laughable, the coincidence that every alleged enemy of Israel is a new Hitler, or that we're told never compare the Holocaust to any other crime, and then we're also told that every one of Israel's enemies is a new Hitler preparing a new Holocaust. The most recent form of this playing of the Holocaust card is what's called the new anti-Semitism. And I suspect most of you have heard about it, the claim that the world is now rampant, rife with this Hitlerite, Hitler-like anti-Semitism. The new anti-Semitism. In fact, two things can be said about the new anti-Semitism straight away. Number one, it's not new. And number two, it has nothing whatever to do with anti-Semitism. Every time Israel faces a public relations embarrassment debacle, every time Israel comes under international pressure to finally resolve this question diplomatically, Israel and its supporters play this new anti-Semitism card. Go to your own library. I assume this school has a good library. It certainly has a beautiful campus. And enter the words new anti-Semitism. You'll see, first book to pop up, 1974, the main so-called Jewish Defense Organization, they put out a book, black cover, red letters, the new anti-Semitism. 1981, the same organization puts out a book called The Real Anti-Semitism. Its thesis that there is a new anti-Semitism. And then beginning in 2000, when Israel was getting a public relations hit over its brutal repression of the Second Intifada, they started again with this claim of a new anti-Semitism. Is there any evidence for it? Well, I did look at it carefully myself for the book I recently wrote, and I couldn't find any evidence for this claim. They said it's rampant on college campuses. That was the big problem. Anti-Semitism on American college campuses. I have to say, I found that kind of odd. Why? Well, as it happens, I have taught at many universities. For an academic, that's not a badge of honor, it's a badge of shame. And if the forces of evil succeed, I will be teaching at another university pretty soon. Actually, probably we're going to be down to nursery school if the current campaign succeeds. Well, having been, so to speak, around the block when it comes to academic institutions, The one thing which is pretty obvious to anybody who's had my experience or even attends any university, they know that college campuses today are so politically correct that you can't be anti-anything. You can't be anti-black, you can't be anti-woman, anti-gay, lesbian, tall, short, fat, or skinny. You can't even be anti-downright ugly. It's not possible. So, to be told that amidst all of this, sometimes stifling and sometimes suffocating political correctness, that there are pogroms, riots against Jews on college campuses, as you were told in the case of San Francisco State University, it seemed on its surface highly implausible. And in fact, in recent times, in the last year, it's acknowledged that this was all fakery. So you open up the Chronicle of Higher Education, the main in-house publication of academics. They have an article, "It's a good time to be a Jewish student at an American college." The head of Hillel, the main campus Jewish organizations, he says it's a golden age of Jewishness on campuses. The representative of AIPAC, the main Israel lobbying group, he says it's a glorious time, not only for Jewish student life on campuses, but for the pro-Israel student movement as well. So much for the new anti-Semitism on American college campuses. Some of you are then thinking, what about Europe? Isn't it true that in Europe they're on the verge of that final solution, as all of these books were claiming? I examined the evidence, couldn't find any. Some of you are thinking, but of course you couldn't find any. All right, fair enough. Everybody looks through the world through their own lenses. So let's take the case of Walter Laqueur, probably the leading Zionist historian in the world, smart fellow no doubt, teaches over in the UK. He comes out with a book this summer entitled The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism. What does he conclude? Listen. He says the popular attitudes towards Jews were in fact slightly more favorable in 2002 than they had been in 1991. Not only is there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism, there's less anti-Semitism in Europe now than ever before. Or consider, you look at the recent Israeli polls. They show, and now I'm quoting the results of a recent one from the last month, 3/4 of Israelis want to be in the European Union, and 1/10 would actually leave Israel for Europe if they were granted EU citizenship. Which means, if what we're told about this new Hitlerite anti-Semitism is true, that 3/4 of Israelis want to join the Nazi Empire, and 1/10 want to be exterminated. What's the purpose of this claim of a new anti-Semitism? Not difficult to figure out. First of all, to turn the perpetrator into the victim. To turn Israel and its Jewish supporters into the victim, and to deflect attention from the real victims and the real sufferers, the Palestinians. And secondly, to discredit all criticism of Israel as being motivated by anti-Semitism. And if ever there were a striking illustration of the point I've been arguing all evening. It's the reception of Jimmy Carter's book. What happened? He publishes a, as I said, tepid account of the actual record. First, he was accused of being a plagiarist. Then, Professor Dershowitz accused him of being in the pay of Arab sheikhs. Then Professor Dershowitz said he was an anti-Semite. Then this fellow named Neil Scher said he was a Nazi sympathizer. Then Deborah Lipstadt at Emory University said he was a borderline Holocaust denier. And then the New York Post screamed Jimmy Carter terrorist. He was a supporter of Arab terrorism. What's the point? The point is very striking. Talk about anything and everything, but don't talk about the content of the book. You can go to Google, check out the reviews. Nobody talked about the content of the book, the actual documentary record as reciting the book. Let's change the subject. Let's talk not about the Palestinians. Let's talk about Jimmy Carter. Is he an anti-Semite? Is he a Holocaust denier? Is he the pay of Arab sheikhs? And it worked like a charm. Nobody ever discussed what Jimmy Carter actually said in the book. Exactly what I said this evening. What's the purpose of all this fake controversy? To deflect attention from and sow confusion about what the uncontroversial, straightforward documentary record shows on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the last item I want to look at, in many ways the most depressing for a college audience at any rate, is the vast proliferation of fraud and fakery, nonsense on the Israel-Palestine conflict that proliferates in our society. To say that there's a lot of fraud and fakery on the Israel-Palestine conflict in and of itself is not saying very much. Because as everybody knows, on any given topic, if you Google it on the internet, about 70% of what comes up is somewhere between sheer crackpottery and lunacy. And about 30% has some scholarly value. What's peculiar about the Israel-Palestine conflict is the extent to which the crackpottery and lunacy is validated by the mainstream press, mainstream academics, and not just validated, but also acclaimed. That is to say, all the conventional mechanisms of quality control, when they come to the Israel-Palestine conflict, all of those mechanisms collapse. They just don't work. Let me give a simple example, and I'll end between a compromise time. He said 10, I said 10:30, I'll be done at 10:15. That's how you solve conflicts. Okay, so that's our two-state settlement. So I have an old friend in the room, somebody who dates back with me from being involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in the 1970s, long before most of you were born, to your regret, not mine. So David Mandel is over there. You can raise your hand, Dave. Yes. And Dave hears my lecture, and he comes up to me afterward and says, Norm, we talk to each other on a first-name basis. Norm, that was an interesting lecture. I agree with you on a lot, but there's one fact I think you really got wrong. Because I read a very good book last week, which shows that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. And at that point, the arrogant academic comes out in me, that inflection of voice, the squinting of the eyes, and I say, oh, David, really? Generally superb. Not one to be intimidated by me. He stands his ground and he says, yes, generally superb. And at this point, I do what every academic does. I start going through those mechanisms of quality control. Nothing fancy. It's not the sciences. It's the social studies for stupid people. Or I should say, to be politically correct, challenged people. So I say to David, the first question every academic will ask, are there academics in the room? Raise your hand. Oh my gosh, so many people who are going to be in the FBI list. Hopefully you have tenure. I always think to make a t-shirt, would the prophets have gotten tenure? In any case, I asked David Mandel, who published that book? Because as every academic knows, there is a range of publishers from what are called the vanity presses, where you basically pay to get the book published yourself, and on the other end, the university presses, which have a rigorous, what's called peer review process. Dave replies, it was published by John Wiley and Sons, which is an excellent publisher. Can't dispute that. He wins round one. So now I ask him the second question that every academic asks. Who blurbed that book? That is to say, wrote comments on the back cover of the book in praise of the book. Every academic, the first thing he or she does after picking up the book is flip to the back cover to see who's praised it. Truth be told, it's not really the first thing an academic does. The first thing he or she does is turns to the index to see whether his or her name is there. And if his or her name is not in the index, he or she starts going through the footnotes hoping to see his or her name, because not all footnote names are in the index. If it's not in the index or the footnotes, usually the academic says, ressentiment, envy of me. This person's obviously jealous, that's why he or she didn't mention my name. And the academic tosses the book away. That's called scholarship. Dave, however, is not an academic. He's something serious, a lawyer. And he says, the book got excellent blurbs. It got an excellent blurb from Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. Got an excellent blurb from Floyd Abrams, who's the leading First Amendment lawyer, specialist in the First Amendment in the United States. No, you can't dispute that. So then I asked Dave, he wins round two. I asked Dave, what kind of reviews did the book get? Dave says the book got great reviews. Boston Globe, excellent review. New York Times Sunday Book Review, excellent review. In fact, the Times Sunday Book Review was written by Ethan Bronner, the deputy foreign editor of the New York Times. Well, I lose round three, that's for sure. And now I'm up against the ropes. We'll skip rounds 4 through 9. And I say, Dave, who wrote the book? Dave now, his chest is huffing and puffing. Who wrote the book? Who wrote the book? The Felix Frankfurter professor of law at Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz. Well, laugh as much as you want, but that's a very impressive pedigree. The senior-most professor at the most prestigious law school on this planet. That's very impressive. And everything what Dave said was true. The book was called The Case for Israel. It came out in 2003. Excellent publisher, excellent blurbs, excellent reviews, and the author, an excellent academic pedigree. It's all true. And nonetheless, notwithstanding and despite, the book is a complete hoax from start to finish. In fact, the book is so ridiculous that large parts of it are plagiarized, not just from another book, but from another hoax. Well, that's pretty funny. Harvard professors, law professors, are known to plagiarize rather promiscuously, but Dershowitz is in a category all his own. He plagiarizes from hoaxes. That's funny. Obviously, it's not possible for me here to demonstrate that fact, but because I take words seriously and accusations of that genre seriously, I did sit down. And in the book I published with University of California Press, I go through in 250 pages in my book, literally going through every sentence in Dershowitz's book. I admit it's boring. And demonstrating that it's all lies. What's most striking about it, in my opinion, is it's true. A large chunk of the book is devoted to demonstrating Israel's human rights record is generally superb. That's the core of the book. But not once, literally, not once, does Dershowitz ever cite a mainstream human rights organization to support his claim. He cites them to attack them. He attacks Amnesty, he attacks B'Tselem, but never once does he cite a single human rights organization to support the claim that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. And the reason is pretty obvious. Of course, if he could cite them, he would. It was still a nice victory. The book did come out, and the expectation was it would get a huge number of reviews because it's about the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's about a Harvard law professor, it's about plagiarism, it's about falsification, fabrication, it's about a civil libertarian lawyer trying to suppress publication of the book. It had all the stuff of a great story. It was Oprah, writ large. The book came out about 2 years ago now, and it did not receive a single review in the United States, mainstream review in the United States, not one. It was really very impressive. It really was. At the beginning, you know, I'm an author, I was angry, I was enraged, I was furious. But gradually, the anger, the enraged feeling, the fury, it came to be awe and bewilderment. I'm serious. I was so impressed by the uniformity, by the synchrony. It was really very impressive. I thought hard, where have I seen this before? And I used to be a student of Russian history, Soviet history, and I could only think of that 1938 meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union under Stalin. And for those of you who know that 1938 meeting, it was very united. Everyone agreed, just like the press all agreed, don't review this book. It was very impressive. Now the reason everyone agreed to everything that the great leader had to say at that 1938 meeting of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they all agreed because in 1934, that was the last meeting before 38, there were 3,000 delegates, and Stalin had 2,000 of them shot. So everyone agreed at the 38 meeting, we better agree. And what's wonderful about our society is you don't have to shoot anyone. You don't have to threaten anyone. There's no fear of going to Siberia, being sent to psychiatric wards, let alone being shot. Everyone knows exactly what to do, no conspiracies. Everyone has internalized all the norms of exactly what to do, what to say, and what not to say. Does that leave me with despair and hopelessness? Not at all. Not at all. I don't feel obliged to give a rousing conclusion. I'm not here as a demagogue. I'm here as somebody who tries to seriously understand the conflict. But I'm very optimistic. I'm more optimistic and more hopeful than ever. And if you wonder why, I'm going to ask you to review in your minds everything I said this evening. Because, in my opinion, now, we have two very powerful weapons on our side. And those two powerful weapons are the weapons of truth and the weapons of justice. Those are powerful weapons. We have the World Court on our side. We have the human rights organizations on our side. We have all the nations of the world on our side. We have the facts on our side. Truth and justice on our side. And now the challenge is, it's not an easy challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. The challenge is to learn how to wield those weapons of truth and justice. That means you have to work hard, study hard, and show just a little bit of courage, spine, and backbone. This is not Gaza. You don't get killed for tossing, if you're a 6-year-old, for throwing a stone at a tank. This is America. It doesn't require very much. A little backbone, a little courage, a little study, a little grit, a little patience. Learn how to wield those weapons of truth and justice. And I say, however much money they have, and they have a lot, however powerful they are, and they're powerful, and however ruthless they are very ruthless. Notwithstanding the money, despite the power, notwithstanding the ruthlessness, I remain totally, completely confident that if we learn how to wield those weapons of truth and justice, we can yet win. Thank you. Now I have an ironclad rule, which is everyone here was respectful of me, and I went on at some length, not Castro, not Hugo Chavez, but it was at some length. So I always like to take questions from dissenters first, because they showed respect and courtesy, and so those who want to express disagreement, I would like them to come up first and let them have, as it were, the first crack at me.
Actually, so the way question and answer is going to work is only five people at a time on each side, and the Aggie host will actually be holding the mic. So if 5 people at a time can only come up on each side, and you only have 1 minute to ask your question, please no follow-up questions, or you'll have to be cut off.
Okay, let's start.
Thank you. The gentleman who started the talk today, Professor Shahabi, said something interesting about his experience in living in Israel, where he was taken off the bus because he was protesting the attack against Lebanon, the war with Lebanon. And I thought it's an interesting comment because if you had been in Beirut or Hebron or Jenin or one city like that, and you would have been protesting the Arab actions, the Muslim actions, you would have been killed. Your body would have been mutilated, and so at least you would have allowed to live. Norm, I think the central point is to me about what you talked about, were that the conflict is way overblown. Controversy is much simpler. I agree with that. And you seem to say, in fact, you started with the comment that telling only half the story. It's interesting that you spent most of your career based upon Benny Morris and using Benny Morris and quoting Benny Morris. And interestingly, Benny Morris in recent years has come to say that you are a plagiarist. So while you are making that attack against Dershowitz, Morris says you are a plagiarist, that your information is completely out of context. He may use the word liar, but I'm not sure, but he uses words to that effect. And so even now, you continue to use Benny Morris, because now that he has said that about your works, now you defend him. But in actual fact, everything that you wrote for years
Could you
was based on
please get to the question?
If you hold as almost inviolable the notion that land cannot be taken by war, have you ever spoken out, or did you ever speak out, when the West Bank was taken by Jordan, and when Gaza was taken by Egypt, and when both of those territories were refused to be given back to the so-called Palestinian Arabs, or given to them? How come they didn't do anything? Question. And part B of that question is...
I'm sorry, I think your time is up.
No, wait. He negotiated to 10:15. He went to 10:25. It's cool.
Nobody can question.
I can't negotiate.
I leave it up to... Okay.
And by the way, Norm?
Yeah.
My name is Mark Crouch, R-A-U-C.
Okay. There are several statements made. I won't comment on the one that was directed at the speaker that's preceding me, though it ought to be remembered simply as a fact that during the June 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which, as Ze'ev Ma'oz, your professor here, Davis, clearly states in his book, Defending the Holy State, he says that the June 1982 invasion of Lebanon was a clear case of Israeli aggression. He says some people like to call it a war of choice, but he says that's a euphemism. It was a war of aggression. It also ought to be remembered in that war of aggression, according to Ma'oz, the figures are, now these are my figures from Robert Fisk, between 18 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. So in the face of that record, for him to talk about Arab atrocities in the Lebanon war is, to say the least, benighted. On the question of Benny Morris, it's true in recent years he's called me many names, most of them very unflattering. To the best of my knowledge, I could be corrected on this. You are mistaken when you say he's called me a plagiarist. He has never called me that. He's called me other things, not much better, I would say. And that's exactly my point. My point is you take somebody who is on the opposite end of the spectrum from me, and the fundamental questions he doesn't disagree. That's why I cited Israel's Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami. On the fundamental questions, though there is a lot of name-calling back and forth, there's no dispute on these issues. It's Benny Morris, not me, who said what happened in what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. It wasn't me who said it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. You attribute that view to me. It's not my opinion. Look at UN Resolution 242. The preambular paragraph says it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Look at the World Court. That's what the World Court said, not Norman Finkelstein. I don't claim to be an authority on international law. I'm quoting to you what the authorities say on international law. The World Court ruled under Article 2 of the United Nations and UN Security Council resolutions, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Regarding my views on the Egyptian annex to Gaza, occupying Gaza, Jordan attempted to annex the West Bank. Were I around then, had I been a conscious being, I presume I would have deplored it. But I was not yet born. Can't help that. I'm blaming that on my mother. Okay, go ahead.
No. All right.
Yeah.
No. This will be quick because I'm not here as a dissenter. I agree substantially with everything you said, but I just need it was kind of entertaining for you to single me out as a foil in your discussion with Dershowitz, but I think inadvertently tread on some sensitive territory because I am involved in politics and in struggles for Palestinian human rights here, among other things. I just need to make sure that people understand.
Oh, yeah.
We're making it up. But I hate to do this, but it's necessary under the circumstances. I have not even read Dershowitz's book, and I certainly wouldn't hold it up as a model of scholarship, and I certainly don't think Israel's human rights is stellar, on the contrary. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I just have a question. Well, first my question was going to be about the fact that you mentioned no argument from the other side at all. Nothing about refusing a two-state solution on 2 occasions. Nothing about brutal fighting between Hamas and Fatah within the Palestinian community. Nothing along those lines about radical Islam waging a war on the West and targeting innocent civilians in cities that have nothing to do with Israel. So I'm not going to talk about that because that's obviously far too big of a topic because you completely ignored it completely. So I'm not going to start talking about it. What I think, you said it's very important that to read the comments on the flaps of the book. So who commented? I was wondering on your new book, how come you left out the ongoing support of Holocaust or of neo-Nazi leader David Duke, as well as one of the main Holocaust deniers, David Irving? Don't you think their ongoing support of you would kind of speak well of your book, in your opinion?
Okay. Those are fair questions. Just my mind just slipped for half a second. The thing you said you didn't want to talk about was, that I ignored that the Palestinians have rejected on two occasions the two-state settlement. But you have to be clear, there are two two-state settlements. There's the one supported by the entire international community based on the June 1967 war, based on the 1967 border, the full Israeli withdrawal. And then there's another two-state settlement. It's the one that Sharon advocates. That is, Israel gets a state plus, and the Palestinians get a Bantustan. Now that's the two-state settlement which the Palestinians have rejected. The record is pretty clear. Give me 2 minutes to just go through it. July 2000, Israel, the Palestinians, and Clinton meet. There's an offer made. Shlomo Ben-Ami, Israel's foreign minister, he himself says, after those negotiations, quote, "If I were a Palestinian, I would not have accepted what was offered at Camp David. Ze'ev Ma'oz, open defending the Holy State. He says what was offered to the Palestinians at Camp David was unacceptable and couldn't have been accepted by the Palestinians. The negotiations continued into December 2000. Clinton presents his famous parameters for ending the conflict. The Palestinians and the Israelis both accept the parameters with reservations. That's not my view. Go read what Ze'ev Ma'oz wrote. Both sides accepted. You have to let me speak. I was polite to you. Okay?
I'm not interrupting.
Okay. You're not listening. The Palestinians and the Israelis both accepted the Clinton parameters with reservations. Come January, the negotiations continue at Taba. The record is absolutely unequivocal. It's Prime Minister Barak who cut off the negotiations by withdrawing his representatives. It was not the Palestinians who rejected in the end. It was Israel who rejected in the end. Now, on the question of my endorsements, you mentioned who's missing. To my knowledge, neither of the individuals you mentioned have read my book. But what is interesting is you don't mention who my endorsements were from. Let's look at the list. Baruch Kimmerling, a chair at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Avi Shleim, a chair at Oxford University. A chair from MIT. For those of you who aren't aware, chair is the senior most position in the university. Sarah Roy, a senior researcher at Harvard. And Daniel Boyarin, a rabbi and chair at Berkeley. With all due modesty, I think that's a pretty impressive record. Now, you want to tar me with a Holocaust denial. You want to pull a Carter on me. Don't talk about what I said this evening. Let's talk about Holocaust denial. Exactly what was done with Carter. So I'm going to ask you a question. Anybody here who knows anything whatsoever about the topic of the Nazi Holocaust must know that the world's leading authority, by a wide margin, it's not disputed by any scholar in the field, the world's leading authority is Raoul Hilberg, the author of the classic The Destruction of the European Jews, his 3-volume study, which actually created the whole field of Holocaust studies. Now, you must know that Raoul Hilberg blurred, referring to those blurs, he blurred the Holocaust industry and called it a breakthrough. And you must know that just last week, Raoul Hilberg came on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! And said, quote, that my place in history is secure on the basis of my scholarship. End of story.
Hello. I recall a quote once given by Mahatma Gandhi that eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And I'd like to go from there. Professor Finkelstein, Hezbollah and Hamas are responsible for tens of thousands of murders of Muslim, Jewish men, women, and children. And I would like to ask you if you call for solidarity with these organizations despite their use of terrorist tactics.
Absolutely fair question. And I suspect you're referring to the clip of me on Sean, what is that guy's name? Hannity and Combs or something like that. So let's look at what I said. Now, if you'll allow me a little bit of history. Nobody doubts that the Stalin regime was guilty of massive crimes against humanity. We're past the era of the Communist Party, and rational people recognize that. Nonetheless, and here I'm going to personalize it, which I try not to do, but my parents they did pass through the Nazi Holocaust during World War II, and they always reserved a special warm spot in their hearts for the Soviet Union and the Red Army, which defeated the Nazis and crushed fascism. Now, both of those statements are true. Stalin was guilty of ghastly crimes against humanity, and it's also true that it was the Soviet Red Army, it was Stalin's regime, which defeated Nazism. Had they not succeeded, I for sure would not be here today. In the same way, whatever one thinks about Hezbollah, during this past summer, they were defending their country against marauders and vandals who, for the fifth time since 1978, 78, 82, 93, 96, and yet again, invade that poor country, which every time it tries to build itself up, Israel comes in and wrecks everything. And so, when the Hezbollah resistance, which, judging by what we were told, was supported by 90% of the Lebanese people, I myself felt exactly like those 90% of the Lebanese people. It was time already to inflict a devastating blow on those marauders and vandals and kick them out of Gaza. And if I can quote one of my heroes of my youth, and remains a hero till my death, Paul Robeson, I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch on that question. They have the right to defend their country when it's being invaded.
I'd like you to address the question and defend your scholarship when on the periodic table 79 is gold, and when you were in high school 92 uranium existed too. So I would like, you said you were alive in 678, but you don't have a 10th grade understanding of chemistry?
I'm sorry, but you don't have a 1st grade understanding of humor.
call it. Israel is an apartheid state within its own borders. Palestinians, they have special laws there. Jews have special laws that Palestinians don't. Anybody who's not a Jew does not have the same rights as Jews do. Israel is constantly confiscating land within Israel. Nazareth is totally surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. Nazareth can't extend outwards. And it's the same thing. There's like over 148 unrecognized Palestinian and Bedouin villages within the state. So I can't understand how a two-state solution can work within an apartheid state. I think it needs to be a one-state solution with equality for everybody.
I think the hour is too late to pursue in serious depth that question. I think we have to, however, be careful about confusing our desires and aspirations with what's realistic now in light of the fact, which we should never lose sight of. This is not theater, and it's not fun. And it's not about scoring debating points. We should always try to keep uppermost in our minds. It's about real people and real human suffering. And we should never make light of that fact. Having said that, I remain true to my youthful beliefs. Why two states? Why one state? No states. It's a nice ideal, and I remain committed to it as an ideal. But I'm not going to play intellectual games when people are suffering. There is no likelihood in our lifetime or the next of one state in Palestine. There is zero likelihood of that. Now, do you want to go to the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and tell them that the misery that they have endured for 40 years, they're going to now endure for the next 100 years? No, I'm not prepared to do that. If there is even a 5% possibility that we can effect that Israeli withdrawal, then I'm going to work for it. Because I can't look a Palestinian in the eyes and tell them what you have now and what you've had for 40 years, you're going to have for eternity. I don't think that's morally responsible.
Mr. Finkelstein, you made constant reference to how many children died because of Israelis, but you haven't made reference to, by your own words, if you Google it, Google children in cafes with AK-47s and military-style berets, and you will see hordes of Palestinian children dressed like that, armed to fight Israeli soldiers, or to be taught to hate them. It's a fact. You can check it out for yourself. It's like Golda Meir said, there will be peace when the Arabs love their children more than they hate the Jews. And a follow-up to that is you keep putting international law as kind of like a governing body to everything you're saying. But if a foreign national here shot me in the head right now, it wouldn't be an international court that would have jurisdiction over them. It would be either our country or the other country. So why then should we say that international law has any jurisdiction over what's going on in a two-state conflict?
Okay, on the last question is fairly straightforward. Because under international law, Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza, and therefore, given that it's an occupation, the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to it. And there is no dispute. Even I think now, I'd have to go through it in my mind, it's a little late, so I have to be careful about what I say, but there isn't even a dispute any longer in the Israel High Court, which refers to it as an occupation. If it's an occupation, then international law applies. That's certainly not even a topic of dispute any longer. On the question of the children, I dare say, at the risk of sounding rhetorical, nobody has to teach Palestinian children to hate Israelis. They just have to live under the occupation for about 5 hours.
Hello, President Finkelstein. I don't wish to enter into any polemics with you, so just to diffuse the audience there. But my question is on international jurisdiction. You mentioned the international courts. What body, if any, is willing to enforce these laws? And part two of my question is that would you say that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is more about the limitation of the nation-state system, where a state like Israel is unable to cope with a population that doesn't fit into its national myth?
Well, on the first question, I think the answer is one should learn from the Zionists, and I'm very serious about that. You ask who's going to enforce the international law or the advisory opinion of the World Court. I think the answer is pretty obvious. So long as the United States opposes it, the government opposes it, you can't get much done. That's been the principal obstacle. But look at what the Zionists did. 1917, this obscure British foreign minister named Arthur Balfour issues this several-word statement, fits in 3 paragraphs, calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Zionist movement is ecstatic, and they run with it. They turn a piece of paper into a living political document. How do you do it? You have to organize. You have to be serious. You have to be committed. That's what they did. 1947, they get this General Assembly resolution calling for partition. It's not a Security Council resolution. It's just one General Assembly resolution. But what do? They organize. They're committed. They're serious. Truman, come February 1948, he wants to withdraw his support of partition and says, let's put it under international trusteeship. So now the Zionists are losing Truman. What do? They throw their hands up in despair? No. They organize more. They work. They show commitment. So you want enforcement of the World Court opinion, you have to organize. You have to work. I think personally there are huge possibilities for the Palestinian movement having a real leadership and not a quizzling leadership. After the World Court decision, the World Court decision said the wall was illegal. Israel was legally obliged to dismantle it, and the international community had an obligation to see that it was dismantled. What could the Palestinians have done if they had a real leadership? They could have organized 1 million Palestinians with picks and hammers and said, we're knocking down the wall, because that's what the World Court said. And it would have really cornered Israel. They would have had a huge problem in their hands. People forget how afraid Israel was of that World Court opinion. They didn't know what to do with it. Should they send a representative to argue? Should they not? Because they realized that it was potentially a very powerful weapon. But unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership is completely and totally corrupt, and nothing came of it. So I don't accept these arguments of well, nobody's going to enforce international law, nobody's going to force Israel to withdraw. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And that's how Israel successfully created a state. Commitment, conviction, yes, there was a lot of ruthlessness, and it would be foolish to deny it. But it was also seriousness. You had someone like Abba Eben. He's a very smart guy. Triple honors at Cambridge or Oxford, I can't remember which, he did Cambridge. He could have done anything with his life. He could have gone anywhere. And at that time, the Zionist movement was nothing when he joined it. But he was committed to the idea. He had conviction. And that's what made that idea a reality. And our side has to learn from that. As I said, it's hard work. It requires conviction. It requires dedication. But if you show that, it's really not so difficult. What's most striking, and I speak almost every week in between a very heavy teaching schedule, what's most striking is the other side can't answer anything anymore. Not because I'm so smart, no. It's because the whole record is weighted against them. They have no weapons left, so they have to accuse me of not knowing the periodic table.
Unfortunately, because of time, we will only allow for one more question, and that's it, because we have to be out of here by a designated time.
Dr. Finkelstein, I'll go to the last question. I do want to say I'm very glad that you denounced terrorism amongst the armed wing of Hamas, and I'm assuming you apply that to Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade too. But what I want to know, because I'm assuming if you've done human rights research with what Israel's done to the Palestinians, what have the human rights organizations said about what Hamas and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Fatah before they renounced or before they became a political party? What did the human rights organizations say about what they do towards Israelis and to Jews?
Right, well, you should have listened closely to what I said. I said on the question of human rights, I will look at what is the most commonly discussed question, namely the question of fatalities. And I said that 1,000 Israelis have been killed. And I said overwhelmingly they were civilians. I didn't deny that. All I did was apply the principle of reciprocity and looked at the other side of the equation, and I said it happens that 4,000 Palestinians have been killed, and they too were overwhelmingly civilians. Now, it happens also, I gave you the best possible case. Why? Because if you look at the human rights record, listen closely because it's important. On the question of fatalities, there is something in the Israeli column. There were Israelis killed. But then if you look at the human rights reports, they'll have a column on house demolitions. Thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished. Israeli column, 0. You turn to the question of torture. Human rights reports say just between the years 1987 and 1993, tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees were tortured. How many Israelis were tortured by Palestinians during those years? 0. Curfews. And you go down the list. It's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And the Palestinian side, the numbers are quite horrifying. The only case where there is a listing in the Israeli side is the one I mentioned, fatalities. Does that mean human rights organizations are prejudiced against Israel? No. All of those numbers and all of those blank spots on the Israeli side are simply reflective of a basic elementary fact. It's Israel that's occupying Palestine and not Palestine that's occupying Israel.
I'd like to thank Dr. Finkelstein for taking the time to come.